Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Kennan Institute. My name is Michael Kimmage. I'm the director of the Kennan Institute, and it is a distinct and at the same time somber honor to gather here this morning to participate in the launch of this very remarkable book by Victoria Amelina, and the title is, of course, Looking at Women, Looking at War, a War and Justice Diary. This is a work of reportage, a work of commemoration, and I would also say, given who the author is, a distinguished Ukrainian writer, a work of great literary value that is destined to join other such works in the future by George Orwell and the like, in terms of understanding what war is, in a sense, from the inside. I would encourage you, this is just an institutional comment, to keep up to date with Kennan Institute publications on the war and its consequences on our Focus Ukraine blog and through the various work that we do, and also to view our Kennan Institute 50th anniversary timeline on the website. And in the spirit of housekeeping to our audience, if you have questions for today's events, please hand them to our staff who are here in the room, and I will be very glad to pose the questions myself. So let me first introduce our speaker today. Tatiana Teren is a Ukrainian journalist, cultural manager, and also works at PEN Ukraine, has worked at PEN Ukraine since 2018. Previously served as the head of the Ukrainian Book Institute, and has worked as a TV presenter, editor, and journalist for leading Ukrainian media, including Ukrainska Pravda, Kultura, Channel 5, and Book Basket on Kharkiv's ATBK. Tatiana is also the author of 5 books featuring interviews with Ukrainian writers and critics. And here as well, it may state on our program that we were to have the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States with us this morning, but due to pressing circumstances, she's unfortunately unable to join, and so we'll have some opening remarks from the Counselor for Public Diplomacy at the Ukrainian Embassy. That's Katerina Smagli. So Katerina, the floor is now yours, and then we'll turn to remarks from Tatiana in just a moment.
Thank you, Dr. Kimmage. Dear friends, dear colleagues, Tatiana, great pleasure being here on behalf of the Embassy of Ukraine to the United States, and Ambassador Oksana Markarova, who was supposed to be here, but unfortunately, due to pressing circumstances, couldn't join us, so I'm stepping in her shoes. Great honor joining all of you today for the special tribute to Victoria Amelina and her wonderful book, Looking at Women, Looking at War, that enters the US book market today. I would like to thank the organizers, the Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center, for hosting this important event, and sincerely appreciate Kennan Institute's continuous efforts to promote a better understanding of Ukraine, our history, our culture. And I also want to thank Tatiana Teren, her colleagues at PEN Ukraine and St. Martin's Press for working tirelessly to complete what Victoria started in 2022 but couldn't complete due to her untimely death in the summer of 2023. I believe that we're truly fortunate that Tatiana is here with us, together with Victoria's husband, Alex, who is in the audience, and Emma Shercliffe of Lexfield Literary Associate, who came from London to join our presentation today. It has been underscored on many occasions that Victoria's book is not only a work of literature, but a testimony to the awful crimes committed by Russia against Ukrainian culture and people for centuries. It is a beautifully written book that offers a lesson of enormous empathy, personal courage, and living by one's principles. Victoria Amelina is one of those remarkable women leaders whose commitment to justice and bravery will never be measured up against. Canadian writer Margaret Atwood, who wrote a foreword to the book, compared Victoria to Martha Gellham, one of the greatest war correspondents of the 20th century, the only woman to land at Normandy on D-Day, and one of the first journalists to report from the Dachau concentration camp when it was liberated by US troops in April 1945. Indeed, Victoria's brave, principled, and relentless pursuing of her mission to ensure that justice is served to the numerous victims of Russian war crimes committed to Ukraine deserves this comparison. Victoria died because of a Russian missile attack on the city of Kramatorsk, which is precisely the war crimes that Victoria herself sought to document. And it is a special sort of tragedy that she was killed because of yet another injustice. What is very special about Victoria's book is that she skillfully puts the present Russian crimes against Ukrainian cultural elites in a much broader historical context and demonstrates that what Russia is doing today is a continuation of its past and centuries-long intent to destroy Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian nation. I will not go into details about the book because I believe that Tatiana will do it much better than me, but I would personally, having read the book myself, encourage all of you to get a copy and be inspired, just like I was inspired by Victoria's fate and her generation. Because Victoria's book is truly special. It will help you to understand the fate of generation after generation of Ukrainian writers who fell victim of totalitarian regimes and ideologies, be them communist, fascist, or the present-day Ruski Mir doctrine. After reading this book, you will see a myriad of stories and portraits of remarkable Ukrainian women who carried on their shoulders the heavy toll of this war, while their men, husbands, brothers, fathers, sons, fought on the front line. I met a lot of people whom I know personally in this book and learned once again, it is one thing to read about this in the news, but it is another thing to read about this in the book and the way Victoria presented it. So if you buy the book and if you read it, you will learn the remarkable story of the Kharkiv Literature Museum director, Tatiana Pilipchuk, who risked her life to save her unique museum collection. You will learn the story of Ukraine's Nobel Prize winner, Oleksandra, who dreamt of being a theater director but pursued justice instead after discovering the story of Ukrainian writer Vasil Stus, the most legendary dissident among the 60s who was killed in the Russian camp. You will learn the story of Svetlana Povalyeva, a journalist and a member of the Ukrainian PEN herself, who lost her dear son, Roman Ratushny, a sincere and uncompromising activist, one of the heroes of the Revolution of Dignity who was killed by the Russian army while liberating the city of Izum in June 2022. You will learn the story of Katerina Rashevska, a young lawyer from Poltava, who helped to return Ukrainian children from Russian captivity. And many other dear friends of mine, like paramedic Tyra, former journalist and now a soldier Lesia Hanja, and so many others who continue defending Ukraine's sovereignty and protecting its culture. There is one important episode in the book when Victoria strolled the streets of her native city of Lviv and finds a plaque dedicated to Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer who coined the term genocide. And then the thought comes to her mind that this plaque seems to be out of place. It belongs to another story about achieving justice, acknowledging the truth, and saying never again. We hope that when peace is restored in Ukraine, it will be a just peace, a long-lasting peace, because justice is what those victims of Russian crime is what they deserve. So thank you again to the Kennan Institute for hosting it. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to remember Victoria. And please make sure that her book is known and widely read. Thank you, Tatiana.
Katerina, thank you so much for your comments and also for providing such helpful context for the book and for the author's life and untimely death. I'll make only one very brief remark about the book. I mean, it's today that the book is published in the United States, so I don't assume that the audience has read it. You'll be hearing more about it very shortly from Tatiana, but the book begins, not to give too much away, but it begins really with two images. And the first is of Victoria Amelina buying a gun, which she, as a literary figure, intellectual, didn't imagine herself doing, but felt that she had to do. This is before the 24th of February, 2022. And then, simultaneously, she goes on vacation with her son to Egypt. And so you get two images at the very beginning of the book, one of impending violence and the other of normal daily life. And throughout the book, what this author does in ways that are at times lyrical, at times simply very powerful and always vivid and very memorable, is to weave together these two things: great geopolitical events, violence, the terrible war that began on the 24th of February, but also the intimacies of personal life and the humanizing intimacies of personal life. And I would say, as a student of this event, I often worry that the dominance of war in the presentation, especially in the United States, that war becomes the cardinal fact about Ukraine, can crowd out perhaps the human dimensions of what's happening. It's a book like this that can restore that proportion back to where it should be. And so, Tatiana, I want to begin with a question that's a bit on the general side before we move into the book itself, given the work that you've been doing over the last couple of years. If you could tell us the story of Ukrainian letters during wartime, sort of Ukrainian writing, literature, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, but writing of this kind, and what has been the story over the last 3 years, if we can start there.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for having me here and giving me this opportunity to speak on behalf of Victoria and staying here in this audience with Alex, Amelina, with Emma Shercliffe, all great people who helped this book to be published in different countries. So I think this first question, it's a great point to start our conversation about this book and about Victoria's choice during the Russia's war against Ukraine. Because of course, after 2014, when Russia started the war against Ukraine, and especially after 2022, the majority of Ukrainian writers, intellectuals, artists had to change their role in our society, sometimes had to change their profession, their work field. The same was with Victoria, because you know that she became a war crimes researcher after 2022. And if you speak about Ukrainian writers in general, some of them joined the Ukrainian armed forces. Some of my colleagues joined the army even before 2022. Some of them continued their work, their advocacy work abroad as Ukrainian ambassadors in different countries. And I think that all Ukrainian intellectuals became volunteers. And I know that, for example, Andrei Lyubka, great Ukrainian author, visited Washington recently. And he used to be one of the most famous, I think, Ukrainian writers before 2022. And then he decided to stop writing fiction. And he became a volunteer who has bought already more than 300 of cars for Ukrainian army at this moment. And there was the same with Victoria, because she wrote 2 novels. She wrote 2 books for children. She started writing poetry at the beginning of full-scale war. Then she started writing essays in English for foreign media. And in spring, summer 2022, she decided to join the Truth Hounds organization, which is documenting war crimes in Ukraine. But Michael, your question was also about topics and genres. I can say that the majority of Ukrainian writers, and not only writers, if you speak about filmmakers, artists, all of them now focused on documentation of our war reality. So because of that, reportage books, non-fiction books, and of course poetry, which is very powerful genre in Ukraine. Now this is the main part of our literature, because of course it's just impossible to write fiction in these conditions in Ukraine, because you can't even think about artificial reality when you live in the war all the time.
Thank you so much. And then to move on to 2 questions, and Katerina covered some of this ground, but I'm curious to ask you in your words to address these points, a bit more on your sense of who Victoria Amelina was as a writer, her cultural significance in Ukraine, and then a few more words about the circumstances of her tragic death. If you could offer that would be great.
We started speaking with Victoria, I think, in 2015, when she published her first very important novel, The Fall Syndrome, about the revolution of dignity. And then we became really close friends after 2018, when I joined PEN Ukraine as an executive director. And I remember that on the first day of my work, Victoria wrote to me that if you organize any human rights campaigns or just activities, please write to me, because I'm always ready to help with any human rights initiatives in Ukraine and abroad. And I should say that she used to be such an active member of pan-Ukraine community and pan-international community. And we had a lot of trips together across Ukraine and to India, to London. So she was a very active human rights defender, I can say. Another important part of her portrait for me that she was an amazing friend. She was such a type of person who always knew when it's important to ask you, how are you today? And Victoria was the one who wrote to me at the beginning of full-scale war, which I met in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine. And she offered me to go to Lviv and to stay with her in her Lviv apartment, which was a bit safer place at that moment. And in 1 week, I moved to Lviv with my friend, her grandmother, her mother, and 3 cats. And Victoria hosted us in Lviv during 3 weeks in my case. So she was very supportive, and she had a great feeling of empathy for everyone around her. So because of that, she was helping so many people at the beginning of full-scale war. She gave her apartment, her clothes, money, everything she had for these people. Also, she was such a type of person who always motivated and inspired you to start to launch new initiatives. And you know, even now, after her death, I published some books and launched some initiatives, and I wrote that the main idea was Victoria Amelina's idea in this case. And another very important feature that she loved connecting people. You know, all the time when she met some great, talented people, after this meeting, she created dozens of chats with her colleagues, other writers, because she thought that it's so important for people to be together and to know each other. So I think these are the main features about her. And if you speak about the tragedy moment, about her death, it's important for me to tell you a little bit about chronology of that period in Victoria's story, because before the tragedy, she received an invitation from the Columbian University in Paris, and she was going to spend some time in Paris finishing this book at the residency of the university. And because of that, she wanted to visit and to meet many people before this trip, just to collect more materials for her future work and for this book. And we had a plan to present Volodymyr Vakulenko's diary. Maybe we will discuss it later at the Book Arsenal Festival in Kyiv. This is our biggest literary festival in Ukraine. And just 2 days before this festival in June 2023, she wrote to me and sent the final manuscript of this book, because Victoria knew that many pan-Ukraine members sent me their unfinished or unpublished books, especially writers who joined the army, and they asked me to save this manuscript for Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian history. And Victoria, I don't know why, but she decided to do the same. So she sent me this manuscript and wrote that if something happens with her in Kherson, because she was going to Kherson, the city which was liberated by the Ukrainian army, but which is attacked by Russians heavily every day. And before this trip, she decided to send the manuscript and to ask me to stay in touch with Amelina if something happens, and to help Alex to finish and publish this book. And then we had a presentation of Volodymyr Vakulenko's diary at the Book Arsenal Festival. And to be honest, no one in our circle of her close friends know about her very spontaneous decision to go to the Donetsk region with a group of Colombian writers. But I should say that it was one more Victoria's mission to spread the truth about Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine among foreign intellectuals. And because of that, when our colleagues from Colombia invited her to join them in their trip to Kramatorsk, Donetsk region, Victoria decided to go. She visited one more time Kharkiv, Izum before Kramatorsk, and then, as Michael already mentioned, on June 27th, 2023, Russians attacked the pizza restaurant in the center of Kramatorsk, where Victoria had lunch with Colombian colleagues. So Victoria was heavily injured, and then her relatives and her friends spent some days with her in Dnipro Mechnikov Hospital. And we started speaking about this book already in July 2023, just, I think, 2 weeks after the tragedy.
I'll pause here just to note for those who have come into the room a little bit more recently that we welcome your questions, but please put them in written form and flag our Kennan Institute staff, and we'll be sure to try to ask all of the questions that come in. So, Tatiana, you mentioned the term genre, and it is the case for me reading the book. I think Margaret Atwood rightly refers to Martha Gellhorn, but I think Orwell is also somebody who comes to mind in terms of genre, and I have, of course, in my mind, Homage to Catalonia, which is a set of reflections. To a degree, it's also Orwell's own story, and I think he was more detached from the Spanish Civil War than Victoria was from the war she was living through. But there is a personal story, and at the same time, there's all of this portraiture of the people who are enduring things, together with George Orwell, the Observer. And you also mentioned diaries. That, to me, seems one of the most significant genres of Ukrainian writing about the war so far, at least in the English language domain. I think quite a few have been published and come through and are very powerful, and this is partially that, but it's not mere portraiture, and it's not merely a diary. It's more complicated than that, and I think that there are questions to disentangle about the nature of this book, the kind of communication that's taking place within it. It reads very, very quickly and easily. It's a very cleanly written book, but I would say it's also a rather complicated book, and so wanted to ask about genre in your view.
Yeah, I agree that if you speak about genre of this book, it's more complicated, but at the beginning, in summer 2022, when Victoria understood that she wants to write a book, a non-fiction book in English, so this book was written in English, she wanted to prepare for the foreign audience such a collection of reportage stories about Ukrainian women who documenting war crimes against Ukraine since 2014. So it was her first idea, and I remember that she sent us like first chapters, first text for this book already in summer 2022. But then, of course, as a very talented writer, she started working on the structure of this book. She started reading more specific literature on war crimes, on Ukrainian history, and meet a lot of people, experts in these fields. And she started working on, I think non-fiction is the best and right description of this genre, because she combines not only reportage elements, but also her own diaries, some fragments of interviews, or her conversations with witnesses of these crimes, and also even field reports about field missions of truth hounds to the liberated and territories of Ukraine. So it's more complicated, though we can't know what could be this book at the end of writing and editing, because you know that when writer works on their books, usually they can change a lot during this process. And in this case, since Victoria was killed by Russia and since she didn't have this possibility to finish this book, to finish editing of this book, we can't know about the possible final result. Our mission, our goal, if you speak about the editorial group which was working on this book during 1 year approximately, our goal was to save everything as Victoria added to this manuscript. Unfortunately, she finished the structure, the composition of this book. So we had a plan, we had her scenario, and we had a lot of finished parts, especially at the beginning and at the end. And in these parts, you can see and you can feel how talented she was, how talented she is in this book as a writer, as a Ukrainian, as a great woman, mother, war crimes researcher. So we were trying to save everything as it was, but also our editorial team added more than 100 footnotes for this book just to help the audience, help readers to understand Victoria's main idea. And also thanks to Alex, who knows everything about Victoria's archive, we had a possibility to compare some chapters of this book in Victoria's archive and in this manuscript, and in some places we added a more completed version of her writing.
Well, in a way, you've anticipated my next question with that very rich description of how the book was brought to completion. And this is about the passages in the book that are not quite finished. So it seems to me like one of the editorial choices that you made was to finish much of it. And of course, it is a finished book, but not to leave it in a sort of totally perfect state, to kind of leave a bit of open space and a certain amount of roughness, I think, to reflect your sense of what this book signifies and means. But let me not put words in your mouth. I wanted to ask about the somewhat unfinished elements of certain aspects of this book.
Yeah, if you read our afterword for this book, you can see the title "Empty Pages," and I think this is a very symbolic or maybe even metaphoric phrase, "empty pages," because of course you can see these empty pages in this book, and also empty pages can help us to describe what we are feeling without Victoria in our life, in our history, in our culture, and why this metaphor is so painful for us, because now we have been losing already more than 180 Ukrainian artists since 2022. But we also remember about previous periods in our history when the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, killed so many talented Ukrainian intellectuals, thousands in 1930s, then awful repressions in 1960s, and all these people who were taken from us by Russia, all of them didn't finish their works, didn't finish their books, and because of that, this metaphor of empty pages, it's a painful metaphor of our culture, Ukrainian culture. And of course, it was one of the main topics for Victoria in this book and other texts she wrote for foreign audience, for example. And to be honest, it was a difficult decision for our editorial team because, of course, we can understand that it's not easy to read these just empty pages or just very raw notes Victoria left in her manuscript. But we had this feeling that we can't change anything in this work without the writer. And also, of course, all of us had a lot of conversations with Victoria, and our memory helped us to ask ourselves about the right decision in this case. So we wanted to show this process of thinking, process of writing, and to show how the book can look when Russia kills our writers. Because Victoria finished only 60% of this book. Can you imagine? So we were not able, and it was not right to fill in these parts of the book without Victoria. But I do hope that you, when you read this book, you will feel this level of huge talent of Victoria, especially during that chapters which she finished, fortunately, for this book.
I'd like to circle back to the title of the book. Let me just remind the audience of the title, Looking at Women, Looking at War, and it does seem, as a sort of generalization, to be the case that wars can often be told as the stories of men, military leaders, political leaders, if they happen to be male, and then, of course, sort of male soldiers. That's, if you think of most movies and certainly many books, that can be a dominant way of telling the story, but obviously this book is taking our attention and putting it in a very different direction. And so I wanted to ask about three of the, I don't want to say female characters, they're real people, but three of the heroines in particular in this book. This would be Evgenia Zakharovska, Oleksandra Matvichuk, and Yulia Danilyuk, and others, if you would wish to comment on them, the significance of their stories, the way that they're written about in this book, and what it means more generally to tell the story of this war as a story. It's not a story not about men, but as a story about women.
Yeah, I think this is a right observation, that it was one of Victoria's goals to show this awful war through women's perspective. But I should say that women are the main heroines of the majority of her texts. If you speak about Victoria's poetry, for example, all main poems dedicated to women in her literature. And the same with this book. I think her goal was to show all these different roles Ukrainian women chosen after 2022. And even among these heroines you mentioned already, and if you speak others who became a part of this book, we can see women who joined the army, women who started documenting war crimes, women who are amazing experts in advocacy work, as Oleksandra Matvichuk, for example, also journalists who continue investigating war crimes in their genres and in their methods. So we have here 13 Ukrainian women on these pages. Some of their stories Victoria finished, some of them she just started writing for the audience, and unfortunately there were more heroines, more ideas for this book, and we explained it in our afterword, and unfortunately Victoria didn't have a chance to finish their stories and to give the floor for their voices. So I think the main idea which unite all these heroines in this book, this is this huge request for justice for Ukraine. Now during these last days, of course, all of you hear the word peace very often in Ukrainian or in American news. And in this book, Victoria reminds us again that when we have war, usually many words can change their meaning, and especially if you speak about this word peace, because there is one meaning of this word for Russians and another meaning for Ukrainians. For us, peace is impossible without justice, so it's like two parts of one word. And I think it was the main idea of Victoria in this book, and this is the main idea for all these wonderful, brave women who became her heroines in this book.
Thank you so much. And the name about which I want to ask now has already come up, Volodymyr Vakulenko, you've already mentioned, but I'd like to ask you to flesh out his story for our audience and to describe his significance within this book.
Usually when I think about friendship with Victoria, about her work, I have this feeling that there are no coincidences in her life and in her work. And this is one more example in this story, because Volodymyr Vakulenko was a famous Ukrainian poet, children's writer who lived in the Kharkiv region, in the village Kapitolivka, Izum area. And when the full-scale war started, he decided to stay with his family, with his son and his people in the same village, though it was understandable for everyone that this village near the Russian border could be occupied by Russians. And when Russian soldiers came in March 2022 and the village was occupied, Volodymyr Vakulenko said that this is my land and I want to stay with my people in this village. Though he had a very pro-Ukrainian position, and when you live near the border with Russia, it could be very dangerous for you. So when Russian soldiers came to Volodymyr's yard first time and then second time, he understood that he could be imprisoned by Russians. And he spoke to his husband and told him about his diary of occupation. So he was writing the diary of occupation during the days, and he decided to bury this manuscript in his garden. And when this village and this part of Ukraine was liberated by the Ukrainian army, Victoria, it seems, was the first person, the first investigator who came to this village with the Truth Hounds team. And Volodymyr's father told her about the story of this diary, and Victoria was the person who helped to find it, who helped to dig out this diary. Then she sent this manuscript to the Kharkiv Literary Museum and to our team of Pan-Ukraine. And we were working on this publication during 1 year with Victoria as well, and we organizing together Volodymyr Vakulenko's funeral in Kharkiv, and Victoria described this moment in this book. And Victoria fortunately wrote the foreword for this book, and it's a really powerful text. It's like, for me, it's like a part of this book because, you know, unfortunately, she didn't have opportunity to write about the people she knew the best. I mean, like Volodymyr Vakulenko, Oleksandra Matvichuk, she left only notes for these chapters. So it's important to read Victoria's book, but also Volodymyr Vakulenko's diary, like one more chapter of this story, one more chapter of this history. And you know, I told at the beginning about coincidences, and Victoria passed away on July 1st, and this is Volodymyr Vakulenko's birthday.
Let me just pause here once again for the final time to ask if our audience wishes, our in-person audience wishes to submit questions in writing, and our virtual audience is invited to do so on the Q&A function in Zoom. And I ask that because I have 2 further questions of my own, but after that we can turn to the questions of our audience. So Tatiana, I know that you helped to write the afterword to this book, and I was wondering if you could comment on that. So we have her writings on Vakulenko's book, and now we have your writings on hers. There's a kind of web of commentary and connection. What was it? What kind of contribution did you make, and how did you come to that? You know, sort of how did you try to couch your ideas in the afterword?
Oh, I'm not sure that we gave a huge contribution to this book because, first of all, this is Victoria's contribution, of course. But you know, in my friendship with Victoria, I always have this feeling of her presence in my life and in my work. And when we started speaking about this future painful work on this book, we decided with Amelina that we should involve more people in our editorial group, and we invited 2 more Victoria's friends and great editors, Irina Grusha and Sasha Dovzhik. And I should say that it was so helpful, supportive for us to meet every week together online on Zoom and discussing like every page of this book and thinking how can we add something like useful for this book? How can we maybe correct something or compare different parts of this text? And then, of course, when we finished this work, we decided to explain the audience this process of our work, what we changed, what we added, and what Victoria meant in some parts of this book. Because when you see these notes, when you see these just empty pages, of course, you need some explanation and support in this process of reading. So first of all, we mentioned some heroines which were not included in this book, but we knew for sure that Victoria wanted to add their stories to this book, like the wife of Yuri Karpatenko, Ukrainian conductor from Kherson, who was killed by Russians because he disagreed to take part in the Russian concert in Kherson during the occupation period. And Victoria went to Kherson to find his wife and to speak to her about Yuri's mission, about his story. And unfortunately, she didn't add any notes to this book about her story, though Alex has in his archive this interview with Marina. Or another story about Lesa Hanja, who just mentioned here in this book, but we know for sure that Victoria wanted to add her voice and her story to this book. So it was important for us to mention everyone and to show these connections between heroines, between historical periods in this book, because of course, you know, one more reason for me as a reader why this book and this writing is so talented, because Victoria didn't use like, I don't know, line writing in this book. She wanted to show these small coincidences in some way, some connections between people, between her heroines. And it was important for us to explain why she when she wrote example about Tetiana Polypchuk from Kharkiv, it was the right moment for her to tell us about the executed Renaissance in Ukraine. Or when she started writing about Alla Gorska, great Ukrainian artist from Ukrainian 60s, she decided to add her story because Alla Gorska also had to work with investigation of crimes against her colleagues, but in 1960s. So there are small different connections and historical perspectives in this book, and it was important for us to show the audience all these hints in the book and to help you to read it. And you know, on these pages we ask the audience to be patient, because we can understand that sometimes it's difficult to read this book. All of us somehow work with writing, with different genres. And of course, we know how it's important to have the main plot, you know, on the pages. But in this case, we just ask the audience to be patient, because you are reading the book of a murdered Ukrainian writer. And it's important to understand it during this reading. And of course, to remember this is such a talented writing, first of all. And my main feeling that I'm so proud of my friend today, because it was really her dream to see this book published in UK and in US. And it's a very honorable moment, not for us, it's a moment of honor for Victoria.
My next and final question from me is about not the afterword, but the foreword to the book written by Margaret Atwood. And I'm just curious how you made the connection to Margaret Atwood and why you would want, I'm obviously, you know, very eminent and famous writer, but why you chose Margaret Atwood for the foreword.
You know, it's one more moment when there is no coincidence in this story, because you can find Margaret Atwood on the pages of this book at the beginning. And I remember this moment very well, because we had the Pan-Ukraine online project, Dialogues on War, and Margaret became one of the heroines of this online project. She was speaking with the amazing Ukrainian writer Natalka Snedanko, and I invited Victoria to join me during this conversation. So we met in my apartment in Lviv, and we were watching this dialogue together. And Victoria mentioned this moment in the book. And when we were editing this manuscript, we decided that, okay, this is a great moment and idea to write to Margaret and to ask her to write this text for the book. And fortunately, our friends from Penn Canada helped us to organize it very quickly. And of course, Margaret is one of the most supportive foreign writers during these challenging years for Ukraine. And I think this is a powerful text, or when a writer writes about another writer and about another colleague. So we are very grateful that she did it for Victoria and for our culture.
So I'm going to turn to audience questions now, not directly, but via the questions that have come in. And one question is about what this book should communicate or is intended to communicate to an American readership. So, U.S. and Ukraine have an important and at times complicated relationship. What Americans know about Ukraine is kind of an open question, obviously very much dominated at the moment by the war. And I think that this book is maybe unique in the opportunity that it has to communicate certain things. And so if you could comment on that, what for an American readership and an American public might be especially notable and significant about this book?
You told that this is a very unique moment. I think this is a very symbolic moment that this book appeared in US now during these challenging days, days of different negotiations where sometimes Ukraine is not invited even. And of course, I wanted, first of all, Victoria to be here with us because she was such a powerful advocate for Ukraine. She was such a great speaker always, and I'd like her sitting here and explain you what is international law, why it's important to speak about tribunal for the crime of aggression and so on. But I think Victoria continues working even now to help and to support Ukraine. And this book appeared in a very right moment, just to remind not only American audience, because this book will be published soon in France, in Sweden, in Italy, and other countries. It's a great and it's a very powerful reminder about justice for Ukraine, that it's not possible to speak just about peace and to forget about justice for all people who lost their beloved friends, their beloved people, thousands of people during last years. And I think this book also reminds us about impunity. When we forget about crimes, about war crimes, they can happen again in our life. Maybe in Ukraine, maybe in other countries. So it's important to remember about these lessons of our history. So I think this is her main idea. But on the other hand, Victoria is a great storyteller. And first of all, she shares stories of brave, amazing Ukrainian women. And I know always when I take part in different advocacy trips and campaigns, how it's important to share stories of Ukrainian people. And you will find these voices of great, wonderful Ukrainian women, journalists, soldiers, war crimes researchers on these pages. And you will be very proud of all these women in Ukraine.
Could you speak, Tatiana, a bit on the literary influences that mattered to her, the sort of shaping influences from within Ukrainian literature and from within world literature? We have, as part of our discussion, Margaret Atwood and Orwell, Martha Gellhorn, but I'm sure that there's a whole range of writers who made her the writer that she was and the writer that she is on the printed page. So could you speak about the shaping influences of this particular writer?
You mentioned already some names, and it was important for me that you compared this book with Orwell's writing, because it seems no journalists wrote about this connection, which is also very important during these days. As I remember, she mentions in this book, for example, Polish reporter Richard Kapuściński in the story about Vera Kuryko, a great Ukrainian reporter and writer. And I think it was the first name at the beginning of this work when she wanted to prepare the collection of reportage stories. So, of course, Polish literature has a very powerful story of this genre, and many of them translated into Ukrainian. So I think that Victoria reading a lot of these texts. Also, she mentions Derek Walcott, the poet, and I think it was one more important literary connection for her in this case. But, you know, it was a very brave act to start writing the first nonfiction book and to start doing it in English, which was not a native language for Victoria. And, you know, this is her first nonfiction book, so it's always challenging for any writers to start new genres and especially to work with another language. And she didn't want to translate this book into Ukrainian, so maybe it will happen, but after Ukrainian victory. But at the moment of working on this book, she wanted to publish it, first of all, for the foreign audience, just to share the truth about the Ukrainian current situation and about Ukrainian history. So because of that, of course, this book now is a part of this dialogue with other literatures, not just with Ukrainian. And it's important how many names we will see in this discussion about the book, because, of course, Victoria was reading so many books in many languages, and it's you can feel it in this book that she was so talented and really very, very well-educated person.
So maybe two questions as we move toward the conclusion of our conversation. I want to ask one question about Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian writing, and conclude with a question about writing and the literary imagination here, and where books and authors like this fit in at the moment and will fit in the future. But to start with the question about Ukraine, so you've mentioned reportage as a key genre of the war, and I think one of the sort of the cultural artifacts that many people have seen here related to the war is a documentary film. I now can't remember, 10 days, 20 days in Mariupol, which is also reportage and poetry, some of which has been translated into English and sort of become a part of the consciousness here of the war. But you also noted at the beginning of your comments that fiction is sort of not the time for fiction. And I wanted to ask about that. When will it be the time? It's already been a long, horrifically long war for Ukraine, especially if you say it really begins in 2014, not in 2022. So when does the time become almost necessary for fiction? Because it's also a very important way, if you think of the Odyssey and the Iliad, of dealing with the trauma of war, dealing with the question of memory, storytelling, etc. So that's the question I want to ask about Ukrainian literature. When will fiction, in a sense, return to where it must be?
It's a very difficult question, and I should say that we have this discussion really in our literary community, but not since 2022, I think since 2014. There is this very famous question when Ukrainian remark will appear in Ukraine. And of course, literature is not about planning, it's not about some scenarios, it's about creative process. So I think no one knows right answer in this case. Though I should say that since 2022, we had already some fiction books, some novels, and some of them really great. But if you speak about these stories about analysis maybe of the situation, about conclusions, about real emotions it's just impossible to do now because everything goes on, and it's impossible just to stop and thinking and writing the fiction story. You know, it's impossible for all of us. So I think all this book will appear later, and since no one knows about the date when the war ends, we don't know about all these deadlines in our culture and literature. But I think we will read these first books maybe in 5-10 years later. You know, I remember conversation with one British writer about like British English literature after the World Second War, and he told me that, you know, like main movies and main books appeared like in 20-30 years after the war, because at the beginning people usually want to continue their normal life and they don't want to think, and they want to focus again and again on this war reality. So all of us just need time to remember how it's to live our normal life, you know, after all these tragedies. So I think it's just my prediction, and maybe I'm not right, but I think in 5-10 years we will have more fiction books in Ukraine about the war. But I'd like to recommend you to read Ukrainian poetry, because if you speak about Ukrainian literature, the main part of our literature is our poetry, because it's really a very strong, very powerful part of our culture. And also there are so many really powerful movies and non-fiction books. I can mention, for example, Oleksandra Mehed's non-fiction book about the war. You can find Serhiy Zhadan's poetry here in America, for example. And you mentioned already Mstislav Chernov's documentary, and one more Ukrainian movie just received the BAFTA prize, it seems 2 days ago. So we have really a lot of powerful voices from Ukraine, from Ukrainian culture, and we will speak about fiction a little bit later.
Yeah, somehow I'm reminded with the Odyssey and the Iliad, the timing in that epic, it takes 20 years for Odysseus to start to tell the story of the war. So you mentioned 10 years. In that case, it's sort of a 20-year period, which I think is a interesting commentary on memory, trauma, etc. And very finally, since you've almost brought us to this point naturally, mentioning, and it's true that you go to many American bookstores now and you'll see translations of Serhiy Zhadan's poetry and other Ukrainian books. Where should Ukrainian literature fit in English language literature, world literature? There is, I think, a sense that people want to encounter Ukrainian voices. They want to hear them. There's a strong interest, which wouldn't have been a sort of a given 20 years ago. And where should that fit? Where should Ukrainian literature fit in world literature at the moment? Maybe we can conclude on that note, because this book is in some ways a kind of vehicle of that, right? It's a bringing together of different literary cultures. But where should Ukrainian literature fit in at the moment?
I think this is a very important question, and you know, usually when I take part in different advocacy campaigns and hear this question, how can we support Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian writers, Ukrainian culture today? My main answer and my main request, please help us to translate Ukrainian literature. It's not important just because of this war reality, which we want to share with you, to show you in different details and different colors. But it's also important for us to show this long duration of Ukrainian history and Ukrainian literature, because as for me, it's one more Russian narrative, Russian stereotype that Ukrainian culture is like a part of Russian culture, and it started only like 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And through translations of our literature, we can show that Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian culture is a part of European culture, of course, of the world culture, and we can show the duration of this culture. So because of that, it's so important to translate not only modern, contemporary Ukrainian literature, but also classical literature of Ukrainian writers. And there are already a lot of translators who work with different periods of Ukrainian history and Ukrainian literature. But I should say that this is my main request. Please help us to translate Ukrainian literature. It's so important if you want to understand who Ukrainians are and why Russia started this genocidal war against Ukraine, and to see that Russia started it some centuries ago, not just in 2014. And I think that literature helps us to share, to spread this information in the most efficient way, because it's difficult to bring Ukrainian art to other countries. It's difficult sometimes to bring Ukrainian directors, Ukrainian theater groups to other countries. But we can spread our books, our texts in different countries. So this is my main request, to translate our books and to help us to show again and again that our culture is a very important part of European culture.
Perhaps you could say that Victoria Amelina anticipated your points by doing so much of the work of translation within her own literary career. But Tatiana, thank you so much for all of your comments and insights today. Katarina, thank you so much for conveying the moving remarks of Ambassador Markarova. Thanks to all of you for coming. Please keep abreast and attuned to Kennan Institute work on these topics. And most of all, we were honored and privileged to be able to present this remarkable book to all of you today. So thank you so much for coming.